only feels like a hot minute since Grid reinvented itself, and the series is already back again. This time, however, it's doing something a bit different, or at least it's trying to. Grid Legends opens midway through the Grid World series. Cars snake through tight corners when a questionable manoeuvre by Nathan McCain, the antagonist from racing team Raven West Motorsport, causes Yume Tanaka, Seneca Racing's top driver, to spin out. You take the wheel of the partner Seneca racing car amid the action. Driving through smoke and debris, you reach the finish line where you're presented with a choice: continue the story or start your own. By continuing the story, you'll be cast back 16 months prior to the accident and begin with Grid Legends' new story mode, Driven to Glory. If you instead choose to make your own story, you're directed to the more standard career mode. Driven to Glory is the main focus of Grid Legends. It's an FMV driven story mode that follows Seneca Racing Team and their last ditch effort at becoming Grid World Series champions. And yes, I did say FMVs. These live action cutscenes present a documentary following Seneca Racing, complete with shaky cam footage, interviews and wry looks to the camera. If that sounds a bit like The Office, that's because it's very much like The Office, without the intentional comedy. The story itself is about as predictable as you'd expect. Marcus Nadeau, the Seneca Racing Team boss, asks you, driver 22, to join the team as an outlier, a gamble to help them to victory. Seneca Racing hasn't had much luck with their past drivers, so your team naturally takes a little time to warm to you. Throw in a cheeky bit of corruption with a sprinkling of twists that you can see from a mile off, and you've got yourself the story. 36 events make up the story mode's gameplay, each giving you a taste of what Grid Legends has to offer. These events tend to follow, and relate to, a previous cutscene, but there's a feeling of disconnect throughout. The story mode is nothing more than a series of standard race events tethered together by cutscenes. Some races even play out over short snippets of pre-recorded gameplay. This is to ensure that the story hits certain beats, but it would be much more impactful if a scripted event mid-race caused you to crash, rather than a cop-out bit of audio and gameplay saying, "By the way, you just crashed in this race." That's not to say the story mode is an outright disaster. I appreciate the extra incentive to complete races, and there are some great performances throughout, but it feels incohesive and never quite manages to distance itself from the B-movie feel that's synonymous with video game FMVs. Aside from the story mode, Grid Legends also includes a more traditional career mode. This career mode features a variety of events, categorised by difficulty and type. There's a certain amount of openness to tackling the career, with a handful of events available from the get-go. But as you progress, you'll need to unlock later events by meeting certain criteria, be it completing a previous event, or levelling up a vehicle. The racing events themselves are your typical affair too. There's circuit racing, point-to-point, drifting, and elimination. Joining these is a multi-class event type, where different classes of vehicles all race together. To even the playing field a little, vehicles have staggered starting times. That means if you rock up to a race in a Mustang, you'll have to sit and wait before you can go at it against a fleet of minis. Fortunately, you aren't subjected to the entire waiting period, and instead roll in mid-race. Whilst career mode is pretty much as you'd expect, the downside is that it's laid out in a somewhat annoying way. The events are spread across various sub-menus, so you need to keep backing in and out of them to jump between races. It's a minor complaint, but when the previous game had a much better access to all the events on one screen, it does feel like a little step back. I wasn't able to test Grid Legends online for this review, but it's reported to support up to 22 players across all the mentioned events. The hyped up race creator also feeds into online play, but that's not quite as exciting as it sounds. It's merely a set of options to create custom racing events, such as setting the number of laps, weather, vehicle class, tracks, etc. So nice to have, but it's not akin to Dirt 5's playground mode. Grid Legends doesn't fully commit to being a simulation racer, but instead dips its toe in, and in turn, distances itself from being an arcade one too. Instead, Grid Legends sits in this strange middle ground. That's not to say the gameplay is bad, it isn't, but if you're approaching the game with a preconceived notion of how vehicles will handle, it'll take a little while to adjust. Vehicles generally feel a little too responsive and light on their wheels, even when tinkering with the variety of gameplay options. But Grid Legends isn't shy when it comes to its gameplay options. Traction control, ABS and stability control all have a 5-level slider to adjust their strength. Setting this to 0 will disable the assist entirely. You can set vehicle damage to full or visual only, and racer AI is changeable too. Racing lines are also adjustable, although while playing with corners only applied, I noticed on quite a few occasions that corners didn't have any line whatsoever. Dials, player markers, mini-maps and, well, everything within the on-screen display can be toggled on and off too. There's a wealth of options here, which is great to see. The graphics in Grid echo that neither here nor there state from the gameplay. When it shines, and this is, ironically, during any race where the sun's gone to bed and it's raining. Lights reflecting puddles and rain splashes on the camera. When racing in cockpit view, it conjures up those feelings of playing Project Gotham Racing 4 for the first time. But some tracks, in certain lighting conditions, feel flat, in particular the environments in which you're racing. There was a moment early on when reviewing the game that I had to double check I'd not accidentally downloaded the PS4 version. It's certainly not a showcase for modern hardware, sure, but it's far from bad looking. The trade-off is that this runs with a silky smooth frame rate, a trade-off that benefits this type of game greatly. When all said and done, Grid Legends is a perfectly fine racer. If I was to sum it up in one word, it would be inoffensive. The story mode isn't quite the success I'd hoped it would be, and the rest of the game doesn't particularly do anything noteworthy, but it's fine. At any other time this might have been enough, but on the eve of Gran Turismo 7's launch, I can't help but feel that Grid Legends will be massively overshadowed, and ultimately forgotten about in a couple of months' time.